Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're conducting what is essentially a definitive autopsy of the JC Star Level 1 Grid Interconnection Mandate. You know, Japan's national IoT cybersecurity standard for solar and battery storage. Now, we aren't going to be relying on speculation or hearsay here. Instead, we're looking directly at the official record. Specifically, we're unpacking the Ministry of Economy, Trade, and Industry, or METI's, written answers to all 28 questions that were submitted on July 30, 2026. As you'll see, this source material totally lays bare the inner workings of a massive cybersecurity mandate.
Okay, let's dive into this. We found perhaps the most revealing statement from the entire July 30th release right off the bat. When METI was asked why the JC Star Level 1 mandate was applied universally across solar and battery systems, their official answer was simply that they confirmed making it mandatory was not impossible and decided accordingly. Right? The source analysis points out a truly surprising lack of scientific or security-based justification in that statement. I mean, it essentially admits that the primary justification for this sweeping mandate was just basic feasibility, not necessarily enhanced grid security.
So, based on METI and the IPA's own official responses, the source material identifies three devastating structural collapses at the very heart of this mandate. First, it regulates devices that are completely disabled and disconnected. Second, there are absolutely zero comparative engineering documents supporting the policy. And third, there's literally no mechanism in place to check if a device is actually installed safely on the network. We're going to unpack exactly how these three failures operate.
Here's our surgical plan for today. We're going to methodically dissect the technical, procedural, and logical flaws of the mandate. We'll start with disconnected devices, move through the absence of proof, examine the opaque exception rules, highlight a glaring double standard with wind power, and finally, look at a proposed alternative solution known as the minimum duty of care.
All right, Section 1, regulating disconnected devices. Let's start with the first major technical flaw, which is how this mandate defines its regulatory scope. It turns out it's based entirely on hardware components rather than the actual reality of the network. And this brilliantly illustrates the core technical contradiction here. On one hand, you have an active network device that actively communicates via IP protocols. Makes sense to secure that, right? But on the other hand, you have a device where the IP function is permanently disabled at shipment. It is physically unable to communicate with the outside world. Yet, according to METI's answers to questions 2 through 4, both of these are treated identically and are subject to the exact same mandate. Why? Simply because they possess an internal IP communication board component. The source really highlights that forcing a permanently disconnected device to get a cybersecurity label is kind of like regulating a door that's already bricked shut. It does absolutely nothing to reduce cyber risk.
And to make matters worse, listen to this verbatim answer from the IPA. That's Japan's Information Technology Promotion Agency, the folks who actually manage the JC Star label. In their official response to question 8, they explicitly state that an acquired conformity label does not mean the equipment is safely installed and operated. The label basically assumes direct exposure to the internet and merely checks basic product hygiene. It completely ignores how the device is wired, if ports are left wide open, or if network boundaries even exist. This exposes a massive gap. The mandate aims to secure the grid, but the tool they're using, the label, doesn't actually verify installation safety.
Moving right along to Section 2, a complete absence of proof.
And that brings us to the complete absence of technical proof. The source material repeatedly asked METI for the engineering documents that justify this specific mandate. The answers they got are pretty stark. When asked for documents aligning this with IEC 62443, which, by the way, is the global benchmark for industrial cybersecurity standards, METI's answer was simply none. How about documents comparing this to alternative boundary defense measures? No comparative materials. Plans to ensure third-party verifiability? Not planned to ensure. The source argues that this exchange really proves the mandatory requirement has zero evidentiary backing when it comes to comparative engineering review.
So you might be wondering, how is this actually enforced? Well, it reveals a staggering operational hypocrisy in the review process. Because the label doesn't guarantee safe installation, grid connection reviewers are forced into this total administrative nightmare. First, they have to identify special JC Star model numbers, which, by the way, might not even match the standard commercial numbers. Then, they must manually cross-check PDF configuration diagrams just to see what the label actually covers. And finally, they just accept the vendor's self-declaration of conformity. The source points out that this laborious, manual PDF inspection process never actually confirms the physical safety of the grid connection itself.
Which brings us to Section 3, opaque rules and invisible exceptions.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how we shift from technical failures to procedural ones. The source grounds its legal concerns directly in Japan's Administrative Procedure Act, specifically Article 5. This act legally requires concrete, published review standards to ensure fairness whenever the government makes decisions on applications. But, as we'll see, the source analysis notes that the J-STAR mandate relies heavily on informal, conversation-based exceptions that totally bypass this exact requirement, raising some really serious questions about administrative legality.
The source unearthed a genuinely alarming finding from the IPA's supplementary guidance. Exceptions to this mandate aren't actually granted based on security. No, they are granted for the prevention of business disadvantage if competing products exist. Worse still, METI confirmed these exceptions are evaluated on non-public criteria during informal conversations. And once granted, these exceptions are completely invisible on the official product lists, so reviewers have absolutely no idea if a product passed on its own security merits or through an invisible backroom market fairness exception.
Section 4. The Wind Power Double Standard.
This lack of consistency leads to a glaring double standard under the exact same national regulatory body. For wind power, the government is taking a very sensible boundary defense approach, focusing heavily on securing gateways and firewalls. This aligns perfectly with international network security principles. But for solar and battery systems, they've implemented this across-the-board device-level JC-STAR label mandate, which, as we've established, ignores the network boundaries entirely. The source poses a great logical challenge here. Fundamental network security principles simply do not arbitrarily change based on the power source.
Which brings us right back to that incredible quote from METI. Why apply a totally different, arguably inferior standard to solar? Because, according to their own official record, it was not impossible. The source critique notes that this rationale willfully ignores the obviously superior boundary defense approach that's already used for wind power. It applies a label that assumes direct internet exposure to solar equipment, essentially just because they consulted with the industry and figured they could get away with imposing it.
Let's move to and see how this builds into Section 5, Minimum Duty of Care. So the source material doesn't just point out flaws, it actually offers a concrete alternative called the minimum duty of care. Rather than blindly trusting a self-declared product label, this approach verifies actual installation configurations. It requires operators to implement physical network separation, directional control, and real boundary defenses, exactly like the wind power regulations do. The source argues that this approach is technically, legally, and operationally superior because it aligns tightly with international ISC 62443 security standards and, actually protects the grid from cyber threats.
So the crucial point is summarized perfectly by this final question. If the IPA admits the label doesn't ensure installation safety, if disabled devices are being forced to comply, and if exceptions are granted invisibly in back rooms based merely on business disadvantage, are we actually regulating grid security, or is this just a de facto market entry barrier disguised as a security mandate? It's definitely a provocative thought to leave you with. Remember, you don't have to just take my word for it. You can read the full official Q&A transcripts for yourself via the IS3 website linked down in the description to see exactly what METI and the IPA had to say. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer.